Hey guys, do you know someone considering renting their property as an Airbnb? I have worked with Rental Advisor for over a decade, and Rental Advisor provides free rental projections to prospective owners, realtors, and investors for any property in the US. So if you know someone considering getting into the vacation rental industry, have them email management@myrentaladvisor.com to get their free revenue projections. So in my last video, I went over why the woke obsession with power dynamics misconstrues our relationships to each other and results in a jungle of competing tribalism. And I would say that is the core problem with the woke worldview. However, are we just ignoring the systemic injustices that are out there? I actually want to emphatically say that there certainly are real injustices in the world. The violation of God-given rights does happen, and we must do all we can to protect the rights of our brothers and sisters. But we also must be on the lookout for those who have a particular agenda to turn us against one another and exaggerate or misconstrue any and all disparities that exist between groups. There are certain social, financial, and political systems that are entirely run on resentment and stirring up one group with another in contention. And the message is simple. You are part of a victim group, and if you give us power, we will help you. We have to recognize that there is an incentive to those who seek power to tell others that they're victims. One of the primary ways this is done is by constantly pointing to essentially any disparity that exists between groups and then proposing the disparity must be the product of injustice and oppression. After all, if people are equals, then shouldn't they have equal outcomes? If equals are not getting the same outcome from a process, then certainly we can assume that that process is unjust. And after all, are we to believe people who have a worse outcome are just inferior to those who have superior outcomes? Now, this kind of reasoning pushes you into a corner where essentially all disparities must be seen as the product of systemic injustice, because to say otherwise is to imply that some groups are superior to others. Now, is this true, or are we missing something? Should we assume that just because we see a disparity between groups, that the disparity must be caused by some kind of systemic injustice? Let's explore this. Did you know that the vast majority of bricklayers are men? Did you know that the vast majority of elementary school teachers are women? Did you know that the vast majority of NBA basketball players are black? And did you know that the vast majority of NHL hockey players are white? Now, one might ask, why do these disparities exist? Should we assume that some kind of injustice must be happening because we see these disparities? Latter-day Saints rightly have an aversion to unfairness. Any saint who cares about his fellow man seeks for a just society. But we must be very careful because there are those out there who would hijack our righteous sentiments, as Brother Corbett recently warned in a talk on activism in the church.
Okay. The question is, does reverse racism exist?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wait, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. I forgot. I got confused. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Sorry.
Recently, I read a book by the renowned economist Thomas Sowell. It was called Discrimination and Disparities. And in this book, he explores this subject in detail.
At the heart of the prevailing social vision of our times is the seemingly invincible fallacy that group outcomes in human endeavors would tend to be equal, or at least comparable or random, if there were no biased interventions.
Yes.
And explain that for us.
Well, empirically, it is the easiest way to explain it. Almost nowhere, anywhere in the world, or in any period of history, do you find any society in which groups that compete openly end up with the same results.
Again, I'm going to take discrimination and disparities to bring it to American society. It might seem strange, you're right, that during the 19th century of mass immigration from Europe to the United States, it was not uncommon to find Jewish and Italian neighborhoods in New York represented by Irish politicians, a situation that did not change until well into the 20th century. How could this have been?
Because if you look at the history of the three groups, it's clear that the Irish had a lot more political experience in Europe before any of them ever set foot on American soil. I mean, it's really, when you think of how many factors there are at work, it's incredible to think that they're going to work out the same for almost any group defined any way.
Well, as I look at numbers
Paradox.
from various places around the world, I don't find anything faintly resembling an even representation of people in any institution anywhere in the world, broken down in any way. There's been a recent study of military forces around the world in which they can find no country in which the military force represents even approximately the ethnic composition of the society. Sometimes the poorer groups are overrepresented, sometimes underrepresented. There are all kinds of factors there. What's amazing to me is that this notion that people would be evenly represented except for these institutional policies, that notion has had such momentum behind it without a speck of evidence being asked or presented. Because even if you look at activities totally within their own control, what television programs to watch and so on, there's a whole sub-industry of studying the demographic composition of television audiences. Simply because they found that the people, who watch NFL Monday Night Football are not the same people who watch Meet the Press or McNeil Lehrer. And the advertisers want to know who are those people, because they don't want to be selling lingerie to the people who are watching Monday Night Football, and they don't want to waste their product dollar, their advertising dollar. And they find there are very substantial differences, even in things that are totally within the control of the individual.
The fact that groups are different is the reason we should expect different outcomes between groups. Because if groups were not different, they would not be different groups. So the question Dr. Soul drives at in this book is not, is there a disparity? That's the wrong question. The question to ask is, how much disparity should we expect given the relevant differences between the groups? Again, I want to emphasize, the fact that groups are different is the very reason that we should expect at least the potential for different outcomes. So before we try and explain a difference in an outcome, we need to explore the nature of the differences between the groups. There actually is a strange paradox created in modern discourse. On one hand, we talk about our diversity and divide people into all sorts of groups based on their differences. But then we want to say that we should see equal outcomes between all of these different groups. For instance, we will say that men and women are different groups, but when you get into the specific details of what make men and women different and imply that perhaps women may be on average better than men at something due to the differences between these groups, people become very defensive. And fair enough, discrimination on the basis of sex is wrong. But if we consider that women tend to be more interested in people and men tend to be more interested in things, and this is shown scientifically in the research, why would we expect for an equal number of men and an equal number of women to apply for, say, elementary school positions, or, to have an equal number of men and women apply for jobs as auto mechanics? Again, the question is not if a disparity exists. The question is, how much disparity should we expect given the relevant differences between the groups? Now, before you go thinking these differences in groups are ultimately based on genetics, I actually believe that Thomas Sowell argued in his book compellingly that while genetic factors may play some role, the biggest factors on the issues that we care about are often linked most strongly to cultural or behavioral differences.
On the genetic side, by the way, there's a study of families where one of the kids becomes a National Merit Scholarship finalist. In 5-child families, the firstborn becomes the finalist more times than the other 4 siblings combined. Now, that's not genetic. There are other.
It's also not discrimination. It's just luck, birth order, the luck of the draw.
Well, but it's more than that. It tells us something about the importance of parental attention in the development of a child. And that's also reinforced by the fact that twins tend to average several points lower IQ than people born singly, because obviously neither twin ever gets the full attention of the parents. And also, backing that up is that where one of the twin is either stillborn or dies shortly after birth, the other twin has an average IQ much closer to the norm.
I see. Okay, so the point here is we eliminate the argument from racism, which leaves us with the argument from discrimination. And what you're saying is, no, look at example after example after example where we know in more or less controlled experiments, families with 5 kids, twins, and so forth, that there are factors that have nothing to do with justice or injustice, but that are simply happenstance. That's the argument?
Yes. Also, it's also true in 4-child families, 3-child families, 2-child families.
Oh.
It is true in Britain and Norway and a number of other countries where there have been huge tests done.
All right. So
Now, it's common to hear people say things like, well, not all women have less body strength than men, or, not all men prefer things over people. And actually, this is 100% correct. When speaking about the characteristics of a population of people, it's important to talk about them in terms of a bell curve. Let's just use upper body strength as a quick example. If I had 100 women of the same age try and lift weight over their head, you would get a range of results, with most of the results clustering around an average. This is known as a bell curve. Now, if I did the same thing for men, I would get a different set of results with a higher average. But if you look, you will notice that some of the men are lower than some of the women. Thus, it is true that many women are indeed stronger in their upper bodies than many men. But if you had to hire bricklayers and you needed people that are only in the top 10% of upper body strength, you would get essentially all men. In other words, we can estimate how much disparity to expect in an outcome between groups based on the relevant differences between these groups. And yes, while many women are just as strong or stronger than men, on the average, we have to recognize that the distributions are very different. This is why, as a general rule, banning men or women from certain jobs or roles is stupid. There is no reason to artificially restrict who can apply for a position, because there are always men or women who are outliers, and it's totally unfair to those outliers to ban a qualified person simply on the basis of their sex. However, on the other hand, we have to remember that just because there are outliers does not mean that we should expect equal outcomes between groups with meaningful differences. And even small differences in averages can lead to radically different outcomes between groups, as demonstrated by things like differences in the number of men and women in prison.
I guess I'm struck that it seems like a lot of your intellectual project is reasserting difference in an age where we're told that everything is the same.
Yeah, but
it's almost indecent
stupid
to say. Okay.
Well, look. Sorry to be so blunt, but look. The problem with some of this. The problem with some of this. Some of it's willful blindness, but some of it's just ignorance. So let me just lay out a couple of things. So, I've studied personality differences between men and women for 25 years and written papers on the topic. And it's actually an area of expertise of mine, and substantial expertise too. And not pseudoscience expertise, thank you very much. I'm not a pseudoscientist. So my publication record puts me in the top 0.5% of psychologists. So I'm not a pseudoscientist by any stretch of the imagination. And I have 10,000 citations. And that's not a million, but it's a lot. And 100 published papers. So let me lay out one of the personality differences between men and women, because it's worth understanding. And okay, so one of the reliable differences between men and women cross-culturally is that men are more aggressive than women. Now, what's the evidence for that? Here's one piece of evidence. There are 10 times as many men in prison. Now, what's that, a sociocultural construct? It's like, no, it's not a sociocultural construct. Okay, here's another piece of data. Women try to commit suicide more than men by a lot, and that's because women are more prone to depression and anxiety than men are. And there's reason for that, and that's cross-culturally true as well. They're more likely to try to commit suicide, but men are way more likely to actually commit suicide. Why? because they're more aggressive, so they use lethal means. Okay, so now the question is, how much more aggressive are men than women? And the answer is not very much. So the claim that men and women are more the same than different is actually true. But this is where you have to know something about statistics to actually understand the way the world works, instead of just applying your a priori ideological presupposition to things that are too complex to fit in that rubric. So if you drew two people out of a crowd, one man and one woman, and you had to lay a bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the woman, you'd win 40% of the time. Okay, so that's quite a lot. It's not 50% of the time, which would be no differences whatsoever, but it's quite a lot. So there's lots of women who are more aggressive than lots of men. So the curves overlap a lot. So there's way more similarity than difference. And this is along the dimension where there's the most difference, by the way, right? But here's the problem. You can take small differences at the average of a distribution. The distributions move off to the side. And then all the actions at the tail. So here's the situation. You don't care about how aggressive the average person is. It's not that relevant. What you care about is who is the most aggressive person out of 100. You take 100 people and you take the most aggressive person, because that's the person you better watch out for. And what's the gender? Men. Because if you go 3 standard deviations out from the mean on 2 curves that overlap but are slightly disjointed, then you derive an overwhelming preponderance of the overrepresented group. And that's why men are about 10 times more likely to be in prison.
Given this, we should agree that equality of opportunity makes perfect sense. After all, there is a lot of overlap between groups. But on the other hand, equity, or the forced equality of outcome, is impossible without violating the equality of opportunity for all people. This is because if you allow all people to have an equal opportunity to compete, a disparity is what will naturally follow based on the relevant differences between the groups. Now, why does this matter? It matters because it's clear that men and women are different, and people are different, and groups of people are different. We all have different talents given to us by God, and backgrounds that can affect how well we manifest those talents in the world. However, the social justice mentality assumes the existence of essentially any disparity is reason alone to assume discrimination or oppression, without doing the needed honest exploration for what differences between the groups might account for the disparity. Political actors seek to hijack our empathy and our desire for justice to their ends by creating all manner of ites, and then putting us into competition one against another. Now, I am not here claiming that immoral discrimination does not happen, but we also must recognize that many have an incentive to make us believe that our problems, both individually and as groups, are being caused by some group outside of ourselves. I am not here to provide the answers in this video to every disparity, but rather to provide you with the proper questions to ask when you see a disparity. The questions you should be asking when you see a disparity are questions like, what are the differences between these two groups? What of these differences are relevant to this disparity? And finally, how much disparity should we expect given these relevant differences? So the next time a social justice advocate points to a disparity and assumes this is evidence for discrimination, perhaps you should ask them these questions. You might be shocked at how few people have even considered them. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.